A 45-year-old man posted a job advertisement. Just a cook, no questions, no fuss. 3 weeks passed. No one answered. Then a dilapidated horse-drawn carriage rolled into the farm gate, carrying a widow and 3 children. She set conditions. Take all 4 or none at all. Caleb Thorne wanted to refuse. He had lost everything once already. He didn't want to lose again, but the smell of toast from the cold kitchen made him stop and change everything. Please comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far my story has come, and follow to the end, because the best is yet to come. The notice had been nailed to the post outside Danner's trading post for 22 days before Caleb Thorne stopped counting. He'd written it himself, which probably explained why it wasn't working. He wasn't a man who knew how to ask for things, not directly, not without the words coming out harder than he intended. The notice said, "Cook wanted. Black Ridge Ranch, 3 miles north on the Laramie Road. Meals and board provided. No conversation required." He'd thought that last line was practical. Margaret at the trading post had told him it sounded like he was advertising for a ghost. She wasn't wrong, but he'd left the notice up anyway. 22 days. A few curious looks from passing travelers. One man who rode out to the ranch took one look at the sagging porch and the peeling paint on the barn doors and turned his horse around without a word. Caleb had watched him go from the fence line and felt nothing about it except a dull, unsurprised ache in his chest. The ranch was in bad shape. He knew it. The knowing didn't make it easier to fix. He was up before dawn the morning of the 23rd day, the way he was always up before dawn, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he stared at the skillet and tried to remember whether he'd eaten anything the day before. The coffee was bad. It was always bad. He'd been making it himself for 8 years, and he still hadn't figured out the ratio, and he no longer had anyone to tell him he was doing it wrong. He drank it anyway and set the cup in the dry sink and went outside to start the feeding before the light came all the way up. The Wyoming morning hit him like a thrown stone. Cold, that particular late October cold that comes off the mountains with a personal quality to it, like it has a destination in mind and you happen to be standing in the way. His breath fogged. The horses in the near paddock moved restlessly, picking up on the temperature drop that was coming, the kind that ranchers learn to read like a second language. He got the hay down and broke the ice in the water troughs and checked the fence line on the south pasture, which had a section that kept pulling loose no matter how many times he drove the post back in. He was coming back from the fence line when he heard the wheels. The sound came before the wagon did, the particular groan of a rig that had seen too many miles on too many bad roads, the kind of sound that made experienced horses' ears swivel forward in recognition of another creature in trouble. Caleb stopped walking. He stood at the gate and watched the road. The wagon that came around the bend was old in a way that suggested stubbornness rather than neglect. The canvas cover was patched in 3 places. The mule pulling it was not young, but had the look of an animal that kept going out of principle. Sitting on the box was a woman he'd never seen before. Holding the reins with both hands, her chin level, her eyes moving across his property with an assessment in them that he recognized as professional. The kind of look that's taking inventory, not admiring the view. She pulled up at his gate. He didn't move. She looked at him and said, "You the one looking for a cook?" "Depends," he said. "On what?" "On who's asking." She set the brake with her foot and wrapped the reins around the post with the economical motion of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. "Mara Ellison," she said, "widow out of Cheyenne, though originally from Ohio, which doesn't mean much anymore. I cook, I clean, I keep accounts, and I work hard enough that 2 men couldn't keep up with me on a good day. I saw your notice 3 weeks ago, and I've been thinking about it since." 3 weeks, he said. "I'm careful," she said. "I don't make decisions fast when they matter." He looked at the wagon. The canvas sides were still, but he had the distinct impression that something behind them was working hard at being still, in the way that children do. "Who else is in there?" he said. She didn't look away from him. "My children." "How many?" "3. He said nothing. She waited. "The notice said cook," he said finally. "It didn't say anything about children." "No," she agreed. "It didn't. I'm not running a—" He stopped. "I've got a working ranch. I need a cook, not a family situation." "I understand that," she said. She put her hands in her lap, folded one over the other, and looked at him with an expression that was neither apologetic nor aggressive, just very, very steady. "But I'll tell you how it is, Mr. Thorne, because I don't see any point in wasting your time or mine. I don't go anywhere without them, and they don't go anywhere without me. That's not a condition I'm asking you to like. It's just the truth. So if that's a problem, you tell me now, and I'll turn this wagon around, and we'll both have saved ourselves an afternoon." The wind moved between them. One of his horses nickered at the mule. "How old?" he said. 12, 8, and 5. He looked at the wagon again. Nothing moved. "They're not going to just sit in there," he said. "No," she said. "They won't." He should have told her to go. He knew that the way you sometimes know a thing clearly and do the opposite anyway, for reasons you can't fully name until later when you're lying awake at 3 in the morning. He'd been alone for 8 years. He'd constructed his life around the absence of other people, had gotten so used to the silence that it had stopped feeling like loss and started feeling like something he'd chosen. Having 3 children on his property would destroy every habit he'd built. He was 45 and tired, and his back hurt on cold mornings, and he was not equipped for this. "You can come look at the kitchen," he said. Months. Her name was Mara, and she walked into his kitchen the way a general walks into a room that's been poorly managed and is about to be put right. She didn't say anything critical. She didn't have to. He watched her eyes move across the dry sink, the cold stove, the shelf of supplies that had gotten down to salt pork, and a nearly empty flour sack and some coffee that was past its best days. She opened a cabinet, looked inside, closed it. She checked the stovepipe for blockage. She ran a hand along the counter and looked at what came off on her palm. "I can work with this," she said. "It needs work," he admitted. "Yes, it does." She turned to face him. Up close, she was younger than he'd first taken her for, early 30s maybe, with dark hair going to loose from its pins and a face that was direct and tired in equal measure. The tiredness wasn't weakness. It was the tiredness of someone who'd been carrying things a long time and had gotten so used to the weight they'd stopped feeling it as a burden. He knew that kind of tiredness. He had it himself. "What are your expectations?" she said. 3 meals a day, whatever I've got on hand, nothing fancy." "And the house?" "Just the kitchen." She nodded slowly. "The board situation?" He'd thought about this on the walk to the house. There was the old bunkhouse, which hadn't been used in 3 years, which needed work but could be made livable. He said so. "It'll take a few days to make it habitable," she said. "I've got a spare room in the house in the meantime." She looked at him. "Just 1 room," he said. Look, I'm being practical. It's October. I'm not going to put children in a bunkhouse in October." Something in her face shifted slightly, some small recalibration. "All right," she said. "Then I'll need a few things from Danner's before we settle in." "Make a list." She already had one. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket and handed it to him. It was written in a small, clear hand and covered both sides of the page. He looked at it for a moment, and then looked at her. "You had this ready." "I told you," she said. "I'm careful. I make decisions slow, but once I make them, I'm prepared." The children came out of the wagon one at a time. The oldest was Evan, 12, with his mother's directness in his face and the particular wariness of a boy who'd learned early that things could go wrong and that you should keep your eyes open for when they did. He looked at the ranch the way his mother had looked at the kitchen, taking stock. "You need help with that fence?" he said to Caleb, nodding toward the south pasture. Caleb blinked. "What fence?" "The one that's pulling loose. I saw it when we came up the road. The posts look like they weren't set deep enough originally, and the frost keeps moving them. My dad used to reset ours with gravel pack at the base. Stays better." Caleb looked at him for a moment. "How old are you?" 12. "Your father was a rancher?" "Until he wasn't," Evan said flatly, in a tone that made it clear the subject was closed. The second one was Lucy, 8, who emerged from the back of the wagon with a serious expression and a dead mouse in her handkerchief, which she held up to show Caleb. "I found him in the wagon," she said. "He's been dead for a while. Do you have a place to bury things?" "I believe everything deserves a proper burial." "There's a spot by the fence," Caleb said, because it was the only response that made any sense. "That'll do," she said gravely, and walked off to find the spot. Then the littlest one came. Owen was 5, and he came around the corner of the wagon at a dead run and crashed into Caleb's leg and grabbed onto his trousers with both hands, and looked up at him with the sort of unconditional trust that is specific to very small children and large dogs. He had a gap where his 2 front teeth had been, and he smelled like hay and the road and something sweet that Caleb could not identify. "Are you the man?" Owen said. Yes," Caleb said. "I'm the man. Mama said we might get to stay somewhere for a while." She might have been right about that. Owen looked at the barn. Then he looked at the horses in the paddock. Then he looked back up at Caleb with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. "Can I see the horses?" "Owen," Mara said from the kitchen doorway. "Let him come," Caleb said, and was mildly surprised to hear himself say it. He lay awake that night and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds that his house was making. For 8 years, the sounds of this house had been his own sounds, his footsteps, his breathing, the particular way the kitchen floor creaked when he got up in the night, the wind through the gap in the northwest window that he kept meaning to fix. He knew every sound the way you know the sounds of your own body, by the absence of surprise. Now there were other sounds, the creak of unfamiliar weight on the floorboards down the hall, a cough. The little one, Owen, who had gone to bed clutching the edge of his blanket with both fists like it might try to escape, a murmured voice that was probably Mara talking to one of the older children, too low to make out words, the mule shifting in the barn, a new sound among the familiar sounds of his horses. He should have felt invaded. He'd expected to feel invaded. He didn't, quite. What he felt was something he couldn't name easily, something between discomfort and an awareness he hadn't had in a long time. The awareness that there were other people present, that he was not the only body in the world generating heat and breathing and making small sounds in the dark. He didn't like it. But he noticed that he wasn't lying there waiting for it to stop, the way he might have expected. He was just lying there, listening, the way you listen to rain, not enjoying it exactly, but not fighting it either. He was asleep before he figured out what that meant. She made breakfast at 5:30 in the morning, and the smell hit him in his room like a hand on the shoulder. He'd been awake for 20 minutes, sitting on the edge of his bed in the dark, doing the mental preparation that had become necessary before he started each day, the quiet accounting of what needed to be done, the internal negotiation between what his body wanted, more sleep, warmth, stillness, and what the ranch required, his body up and moving. He did this every morning. It took time. The smell shortened the process considerably. He came into the kitchen to find biscuits coming out of the oven, bacon already done and resting, eggs going in the skillet, and a pot of coffee on the back of the stove that smelled like actual coffee rather than the chemical approximation he'd been producing. Mara had her back to him, working the eggs with a focus that suggested she'd been at it long enough to have gotten everything moving in the right order without his presence being relevant to any of it. He sat down at the table. She set a plate in front of him without ceremony and went back to the stove. He ate. He had forgotten, genuinely forgotten, in the way that you can forget things when they've been absent long enough. What it was like to eat food that someone had actually put effort into. It wasn't fancy. It was biscuits and bacon and eggs, the kind of breakfast any ranch cook would have been expected to produce. But the biscuits were right in a way that took some knowing, and the eggs were done exactly to the edge of done enough without going past it. And the coffee was just coffee. Good, strong, nothing remarkable about it except that it tasted the way coffee was supposed to taste, and not like something he'd accidentally made wrong again. He ate everything on the plate and sat there for a moment with his hands around the coffee cup. "You're going to need more flour," she said, still at the stove, "and lard, and potatoes if you want anything substantial this week. That list I gave you yesterday was for a reason. I'll get to Danner's today. I can come. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She turned around. She had flour on her forearm and her hair was completely loose from yesterday's pins now, and she looked tired in the specific way of someone who'd been working since before he woke up, which she had been. "But I'd rather see what they have than read your description of it." He almost said, "I'm capable of buying flour." He stopped himself, because it wasn't the point she was making, and because he was smart enough to know that. "All right," he said, "after the morning work." She nodded and turned back to the stove. He went outside. The sun was just clearing the eastern ridge, laying long shadows across the frost-covered yard. and the air had that particular early morning Wyoming quality, thin and cold and clear enough to ache. He stood on the porch for a moment and looked at his ranch the way he sometimes did, trying to see it from the outside, trying to be honest about what he saw. It wasn't good. He'd kept the livestock going, the horses, the cattle he had left, the chickens, but the property itself showed 8 years of a man doing everything he could, and it not being quite enough. The barn needed paint, the porch needed 2 new boards. The bunkhouse was in worse shape than he'd admitted to Mara. The house itself was structurally sound, but looked like what it was, a place where someone had stopped caring about appearances a long time ago, because appearances required energy he didn't have. He'd stopped seeing it. That was the thing. You live somewhere long enough alone, you stop seeing it. Evan was coming out of the barn. Caleb stopped. "What were you doing in there?" "Fed your horses," Evan said. He was carrying the empty grain bucket, and his expression was the careful neutral of a boy who wasn't sure if he'd done something wrong. "And the chickens. I didn't know if you wanted it done a certain way. I just did it how we did ours." Caleb looked at him, without being asked. It needed doing. Caleb took the bucket from him without saying anything and hung it on the barn peg and said, "Come here, and I'll show you where I keep the tools." They went to Danner's trading post that morning, Caleb on horseback, and Mara on the wagon seat with the children in the back. Margaret Danner was behind the counter when they came in, and she was the kind of woman who'd lived in small frontier communities long enough that she had a particular talent for reading situations quickly and filing them away for later. She looked at Caleb, she looked at Mara. She looked at the 3 children who came through the door behind Mara like a very small invasion force. She said, "Caleb," with a particular inflection that contained an entire conversation. "I need what's on this list," he said, and handed her the paper. She read it. "Somebody's planning to actually cook," she said. "That's the idea." Mara had moved down the counter and was examining the available flour with the focus of someone who took flour seriously. Lucy was standing by the glass candy jars, looking at them with an expression of profound philosophical calm, as if she had long ago made peace with the fact that she would not be getting any. Owen was holding the hem of Caleb's coat. He looked down at him. Owen looked up. "What?" Caleb said. "Nothing," Owen said. "Then stop holding my coat." Owen let go, thought about it for a moment, and grabbed it again. Caleb let it go. Margaret, watching this, set the list down on the counter and began pulling things from the shelves. "You're going to have your hands full," she said to Caleb in a low voice. "I've got a lot of work to do," he said. "She can cook. The boy can work." "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant," he said. "Fill the list." She smiled in a way that suggested she knew things he hadn't figured out yet, which he found irritating, and went to get the flour. The trouble started on a Thursday. He'd known it would come from somewhere. It always did, in a place like Black Ridge, where news moved faster than weather, and people had opinions about things that weren't their business with a dedication that bordered on professional. The trouble came in the form of Dale Hutchins, who ran the second largest spread in the valley and had the kind of confidence that comes from having been the most important man in a room for long enough that he'd stopped noticing when he wasn't. Hutchins came by the ranch on a Thursday morning, supposedly to ask about a stray heifer that had come off the North Range, but actually to look at the situation from up close. He sat on his horse at Caleb's gate and looked at Mara hanging laundry on the line by the house, and at Evan mending fence in the near pasture, and at Owen, who was sitting on the porch step carefully trying to braid 3 pieces of rope together, with the patience of a person who had nowhere else to be. "So it's true," Hutchins said. "If you're looking for a heifer," Caleb said, "the North Range is that direction." "Took on a widow with 3 young ones," Hutchins said, as if Caleb hadn't spoken. "In October, heading into winter." "I took on a cook," Caleb said. "She happens to have children." Hutchins looked at him. He was a big man, Hutchins, with the particular kind of heaviness that comes from prosperity rather than labor. And he had a way of looking at you that was meant to make you feel like you were being evaluated and found short. "Caleb, you've been alone long enough on this place that I'll speak plain. What you need going into winter is hands. Men who can work cattle in hard conditions. What you've got is a woman and 2 children who look like the wind would knock them sideways, and a little one who's not good for much besides taking up space and eating food you're going to need. Caleb said nothing. I'm not saying she can't cook, Hutchins went on. I'm saying winter in this valley is serious business, and you don't have the resources for charity cases. She's not a charity case, Caleb said. She's a widow with 3. She works, Caleb said, in a tone that was quiet enough that Hutchins stopped talking. She gets up before me and she's still going when I'm done for the day. The boys already saved me half a day's work this week. I'm not asking for your opinion, Dale. Hutchins looked at him for a moment. It's going to cost you, he said. Winter comes hard this year, word is. You start bleeding supplies and you come up short. Don't expect the rest of us to cover what you gave away. I never have, Caleb said. Your heifer's north. Hutchins rode away. Caleb stood at the fence and watched him go and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite contempt, but contained elements of both. He turned back to the ranch and found Evan standing by the fence post he'd been working on, having heard enough of it to understand the shape of the conversation. The boy didn't say anything. He just looked at Caleb and then looked at his hammer and went back to work. Caleb picked up the other side of the fence rail. You want to set the next post with gravel pack, he said. Show me how your father did it. Evan showed him. The weeks moved. October went to November in the way that Wyoming months do. Not gradually, but by sudden decision, as if the season has been waiting until it has enough force behind it to make the change mean something. The temperatures dropped fast. The sky took on the particular flat gray color of impending serious weather, the kind that experienced ranchers read as a message. Caleb watched the sky and made calculations. He had enough hay for the winter, barely, if the winter was normal. He had enough food for himself, but the arithmetic had changed when 4 additional people were added to the equation. He went over the numbers in his head every morning and every night, not because the number changed, but because it helped him think. Mara apparently was doing the same thing. He came into the kitchen one evening to find her at the table with a piece of paper, working in columns. She'd taken the household accounts without his asking, having discovered the ledger in the top kitchen drawer and apparently found his bookkeeping inadequate, which it was. She looked up when he came in and then looked back at the paper. You're short on oats, she said. I know. And the salt pork won't last past February at the rate you've been going through it. I tend to eat the same thing every day, he said. It's easier. It's not cheaper, though. She turned the paper toward him. Her handwriting was the same small, precise hand as the shopping list. Every number exact, nothing crowded, everything in its place. If we redistribute the portion sizes and add more starch earlier in the week, we can stretch the meat through March, but it means adjusting what I cook. He looked at the paper. It was better math than he'd been doing. All right, he said. And there's another thing. She hesitated, which was rare enough that he noticed it. The bunkhouse. What about it? It's not holding heat the way it should. There's a gap in the north wall I found when I was in there with the children yesterday. If that stays open through December, it's going to be a serious problem. He hadn't been in the bunkhouse in months. He hadn't thought about it because he'd been trying not to think about everything that needed doing and couldn't all be done at once. I'll patch it, he said. Evan can help. He's good with his hands. Caleb looked at her. You're not bothered, he said, by him working. He's 12, she said, not 5. He needs to work. He's been restless since we stopped traveling. Having something to do is better for him than sitting still. She paused. He's not doing it because I make him. He goes looking for it. Caleb thought about the fence post. The horses fed without being asked. The way Evan had approached the morning chores with the same quiet seriousness that his mother brought to the kitchen. I noticed, he said. She picked the paper back up and started writing again. After a moment, she said without looking up, I know you didn't plan for this to be what it is. He sat down across the table from her. No, he said. I didn't plan for a lot of things either, she said. Plans and what happens aren't always the same thing. What happened to your husband, he said, and immediately wasn't sure why he'd asked. She kept writing for a moment. Then she stopped, but she didn't look up from the paper. Fever, she said. Last spring. It came fast and it didn't slow down. A pause. We were managing with the ranch. And then we weren't, and then he was gone, and I had about 3 weeks to decide what to do before the bank came about the mortgage. I'm sorry, he said. She looked up then, and her expression was something he couldn't read easily. Not grief exactly, more like the aftermath of grief, what's left when it's been lived with long enough that it's been incorporated. "I don't need sorry," she said quietly. "I need things to go right for a while." He looked at her for a moment. "I can't promise that," he said. "I know you can't," she said. "Nobody can promise that. I'm just telling you what I need." She went back to the paper. He sat there a little while longer, listening to Lucy's voice from down the hall, telling Owen some long and winding story about something he couldn't quite make out. Owen's response was a burst of laughter, high and immediate, that bounced off the walls of the old house and disappeared into the dark corners of the ceiling. He'd forgotten what a child's laughter sounded like inside these walls. He sat there until it went quiet, and then he got up and went to find the tools to patch the bunkhouse wall. The night Lucy knocked on his door was the night he stopped being able to pretend that this was just a business arrangement. It was late. Well past 10, the house long since gone quiet. He was at his desk going over the winter supply list for the third time, not because he expected to find new numbers, but because he didn't have anything better to do with his restlessness. The knock was small, 3 quick raps, the kind of knock that is trying to be decisive and mostly succeeds. He opened the door. Lucy stood in the hall in her nightgown, her hair braided in 2 uneven plaits, her expression the serious, considered expression she seemed to wear as a default setting. She was holding a piece of paper. "I have a question," she said. "It's late," he said. "I know, but the question won't wait until morning." He looked at her for a moment. "Come in then." She came in and looked around his room with the same inventory-taking eyes as her mother, except more openly curious, and then sat down in the chair by the window as if she'd been invited to do so, which he supposed he had done technically. "What's the question?" he said. "Are you sad?" she said. He blinked. "What?" "Are you sad?" she repeated patiently, as if he might just need more time with the question. "Because you live alone and the house has been empty a long time, and sometimes people who live alone get sad, but they don't always know how to say so. Mama says that about grown-ups." He sat on the edge of his bed. He thought about several responses and discarded them one by one. He settled on, "What made you think to ask that?" "The room," she said. She looked at the walls. He looked at them too. Bare, except for a faded outline where a picture frame had hung for a long time before being taken down. He'd been meaning to put something else there. He hadn't gotten around to it. "There used to be something on that wall," she said. "You can see where it was." He was quiet for a moment. "People take pictures down when they don't want to look at them anymore," Lucy said. "But they don't always stop missing them. That's different from not wanting to look." She tilted her head. "So, are you sad?" He thought about it properly, which she seemed to deserve. "Some," he said. "That's okay," she said. "We were sad for a long time after Papa died. Mama cried at night when she thought we were asleep. Owen used to cry too, but he probably doesn't remember now." She stood up. "I just wanted to know, because you've been kind to us. Owen likes you very much." "Owen likes my horses," Caleb said. "He likes you more than the horses," she said, and delivered this with the confidence of someone reporting a fact they had verified personally. She moved toward the door. "Good night, Mr. Thorne." "Good night, Lucy." She paused at the door. "You could put a different picture up," she said. "If you wanted. It doesn't have to be the same one." She went back down the hall, her small feet quiet on the floorboards. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long time. He looked at the place on the wall where the picture had been. He thought about what it had been. A photograph. The only one he'd owned, taken in the summer of 1869, when he'd still believed that things would continue the way they were going. He'd taken it down 2 years after the accident because looking at it had cost him something every single morning that he couldn't keep affording. He got up. He went to the bottom drawer of the dresser, the one he didn't open. He stood there with his hand on the drawer for a minute. He didn't open it, but he stood there a little longer than he needed to before he went back to bed. It was the first night in 8 years that he'd thought about what used to be on that wall and not felt solely the need to look away. He patched the bunkhouse wall on a Saturday, and Evan worked beside him the whole morning without being asked twice about anything. That was the thing about the boy that Caleb kept noticing. He didn't need to be told the same thing more than once, and he didn't need to be watched to make sure he was doing it. He just listened the first time and then did the work. And when he ran into a problem, he thought about it for a moment before asking, which meant that when he did ask, it was a real question and not just a way of avoiding the effort of figuring something out himself. Caleb had known grown men who couldn't manage that. They worked the north wall of the bunkhouse from the inside, identifying the gap, a split in the timber that had opened up from repeated freeze-thaw cycles over several winters, and packing it with oakum first, and then driving a strip of split wood over the top to hold it. It wasn't beautiful work, but it would hold the heat. That was what mattered in November. My dad used to say the point of a repair is to fix the problem, not to make it look like there was never a problem, Evan said at some point, holding the strip in place while Caleb drove the nails. Smart man, Caleb said. He was. A pause. Most of the time. Caleb didn't push at that. He drove the last nail and stepped back and pressed his hand flat against the wall to feel for draft. Nothing. He nodded. Good, Evan said. Good, Caleb agreed. They moved the family into the bunkhouse that afternoon, such as it was. Mara had done things to the interior that Caleb hadn't expected. There was a rag rug on the floor that he didn't recognize, which she said she'd found rolled up behind the feed barn and beaten the dust out of. There were curtains on the single window, cut from a piece of cloth she'd traded Margaret Danner for, apparently, without Caleb knowing any transaction had occurred. Owen's cot had an extra blanket tucked in at the foot, and two things on the small shelf above it that appeared to be toys. A carved wooden horse, and something that looked like it had once been a rabbit made of felt, and was now mostly a memory of one. Caleb stood in the doorway of the bunkhouse and looked at what had been done to a room he'd been ignoring for 3 years. Mara came up behind him and stood beside him and looked too. I hope that's all right, she said. The curtains. It's fine, he said. I can take them down if... It's fine, he said again, and meant it, and walked back to the house before she could see whatever was on his face. Mara cooked like someone who took it personally. Not personally in the sense of pride, though there was pride in it. It was more that she understood cooking to be a form of argument against difficulty, a way of insisting that things could be good even when they weren't easy. Every meal she put on the table was that argument made concrete. Even when the supplies were down to the basics, she found ways to make the basics mean something. A pot of beans became something with depth and flavor because she knew what to put into the pot and when. Bread came out of the oven with a crust that cracked right. Potatoes went into the skillet with whatever fat and seasoning was available and came out tasting like they'd been intended to taste rather than simply filling space. Caleb found himself sitting at the table a few minutes before meals were ready, which was something he'd never done when he was cooking for himself. He'd eaten standing over the stove because it was faster, or sitting at the desk because it was convenient, and either way it had been purely functional, fuel going in so that work could continue going out. Now he sat at the table. Sometimes Lucy sat across from him and talked about whatever was in her head, which was usually either a question she'd been saving up or an observation about something she'd noticed, delivered with the same gravity she gave to everything. Sometimes Owen climbed up next to him and leaned against his arm with the unconscious ease of a child who hasn't yet learned to ask permission before being affectionate. The first time Owen did that, Caleb went very still. Not because it was unwelcome, because he hadn't expected it, and the unexpectedness of it opened something in his chest that he wasn't prepared for. Some door he'd thought was rusted shut, swung open by the simple weight of a small boy leaning against his arm at the supper table. He didn't say anything. He just sat there and passed Owen the bread and let the moment be what it was. Mara, across the table, was looking at her plate, but he caught the edge of something in her expression before she looked down. Not pity, not sentimentality, just a kind of quiet recognition, the look of someone who sees a thing and makes note of it without making a production of it. He respected that. He respected it enough that it made him slightly uncomfortable, which was its own form of information. Quote, the Whispers in Black Ridge were doing what Whispers in Black Ridge always did, which was grow. He heard about them third hand, the way you always heard about things in small communities. From Margaret Danner, who delivered the information in the form of a report rather than gossip, which was her particular way of maintaining a distinction she considered important. People are talking, she said one morning when he came in for the week's supplies. People always are, he said. About you specifically. She set a sack of flour on the counter. About the arrangement. What about it? She looked at him with the patience of someone who's used to speaking plainly to people who would rather she didn't. Hutchins has been saying you've taken leave of your senses, that a widow with 3 children is going to eat through your winter stores before February, and you'll be the one who comes up short. She set a tin of lard down next to the flour. He's also saying other things. What kind of other things? She paused. The kind that are about the nature of the arrangement, she said carefully. He understood what she meant. He set his jaw. The nature of the arrangement, he said, is exactly what I told you it was. She cooks. I provide board. That's the full length and width of it. I know that, Margaret said. I'm not the one you have to convince. I'm not going to convince anyone of anything, he said. It's my ranch. What happens on it is my business. That's true, she said, and I agree with you. I'm just telling you what's being said, so you're not surprised by it. She looked at him evenly. The Perrin family stopped coming to Mara at the trading post. Just so you know. He picked up the flour sack. Anyone who wants to be small about it can be small about it, he said. That's not new. No, she said. It's not. He drove home with the supplies and didn't tell Mara what Margaret had said, because there was no version of telling her that made anything better. But he noticed later in the week that she came back from a trip to the trading post quieter than she'd gone, and that she spent more time in the kitchen than usual that evening, working at something. Bread, probably, though there was already bread, with the focused energy of a woman who is using her hands to keep her mind from dwelling somewhere it doesn't want to be. He didn't bring it up. She didn't bring it up. But at supper that night, he said, in the middle of a conversation about nothing in particular, "You don't have to go to Danner's if you'd rather not. I can get what's needed." She looked up. "I can go myself," she said. "I know you can." "Then why—" She stopped. She looked at him for a moment, reading whatever was in his face. "How bad is it?" she said quietly. "It's nothing," he said. "How bad?" she said again, in the same tone. He looked at his plate. Some people have opinions," he said. "They always do. It doesn't change anything." She was quiet for a moment. Lucy and Evan were at the other end of the table, Lucy explaining something to Evan in a detailed whisper that he was half listening to, and Owen was working on his potatoes with both a fork and his fingers, which nobody had managed to entirely stop him from doing. Mara looked at her children and then back at Caleb. "I've had people have opinions about me before," she said, "since I was widowed. The kind of opinions people have about a woman alone with children who hasn't managed to disappear properly." She said it without heat, just as fact. "It doesn't change what we're doing here." "No," he said, "it doesn't." "Good," she said, and went back to her supper. That was the end of it, as far as either of them made it anything. Evan broke his wrist on a Tuesday. He was on the roof of the equipment shed, fixing a section of shingles that Caleb had been meaning to get to since September, and he came down faster than intended when his boot slipped on a patch of frost that had no business being there at noon. He landed wrong on his right hand, and the sound was the kind of sound that stops everything. Caleb heard it from the paddock and was across the yard before he'd fully processed what the sound meant. Evan was sitting up when he got there, which was a good sign, but his face was the color of old paper and his right arm was held against his chest at an angle that said what had happened clearly. "Let me see," Caleb said. "I'm fine," Evan said. "You're not fine. Let me see." Evan let him look, and Caleb ran his hand carefully along the forearm and wrist. Not a full break, or it would have been worse, but a bad sprain at minimum, possibly a fracture in the wrist. His hand was already swelling. He needed to be seen. Mara came out of the bunkhouse at a run, having heard Caleb call, and when she saw Evan's arm, she went practical immediately. No panic, just assessment. She looked at the arm, looked at Caleb, said, "Doc Riley in town?" "Yes," he said. "How far?" 40 minutes. "Then we go now," she said, and went to get her coat. Doc Riley confirmed a fractured wrist. Small fracture, he said. Not displaced, but it needed to be wrapped and rested for 6 weeks at minimum, and it needed to stay dry and stay still, and the boy needed to stop climbing things for the foreseeable future, which was a sentence directed at Evan with the particular authority of a man who had said it to particular boys before. Evan bore the wrapping without complaint, which Caleb respected, and bore the instruction about not climbing things with the expression of someone hearing something they were going to take under strong consideration and probably not fully follow, which Caleb also respected. On the drive back, the four of them in the wagon, because Mara had driven and brought the children, it was Owen who broke the silence from the back by saying, "Does it hurt a lot?" "Some," Evan said. "More than when you fell off the fence at the old place?" "Different," Evan said. "Worse?" "Quit asking." Owen was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I could help with the horses while your arm is bad. I know how." "You're 5, Evan said. "I'm almost 6. "You're not almost 6. Your birthday is in March." "That's almost 6, Owen said, with the inarguable logic of a small child. Mara made a sound that was very nearly a laugh and turned it into a cough. Caleb kept his eyes on the road and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't interrupt something, and he was learning, slowly, imperfectly, when to let things be. The fracture set the work schedule back. Evan couldn't do the heavy work, which meant Caleb absorbed it, which meant the days got longer and the nights got shorter, and by the end of the first week his back was informing him in strong terms that he was 45 and not 30, and that there were limits to what could be absorbed. He didn't complain. There was no one to complain to that would have made any difference, and complaining had never been something he was built for anyway. But Mara noticed. She didn't say anything directly. She wasn't that kind of person, the kind who comments on things before she knows what to do about them. But one morning he came into the kitchen to find that she'd rearranged the order of what she was cooking so that breakfast was ready earlier than usual, which gave him an additional 20 minutes of morning time. And without any discussion, she started doing the chicken coop herself, which was a small thing but was 30 minutes. He got back in his morning. He noticed these things and didn't mention them, the same way she didn't mention that she'd noticed him slowing down by evening. They were, he was coming to understand, people who operated the same way. They paid attention, and they acted on what they saw, and they didn't make a speech about it. It was an efficient way to be. It was also, he was finding, oddly companionable, in a way he hadn't expected and didn't have an easy word for. Lucy asked him about the land one afternoon while he was repairing the gate hinge on the south fence. She'd been following him around for part of the morning, which she did sometimes with the permission of benign neglect rather than invitation, just appearing near whatever he was doing and watching, or asking questions when they occurred to her, or sometimes saying nothing at all and just being nearby in the way that certain children could be present without requiring anything from you. "How long have you had this ranch?" she said. 17 years, he said. "That's a very long time." "It is." She sat down on the fence rail, cautiously, because she'd been told not to and was demonstrating that she'd at least thought about the instruction before deciding it didn't apply to this specific rail at this specific moment. "Were you here alone the whole time?" "Not the whole time," he said. She waited in the patient way she had. He drove the new bolt through the hinge without looking up. "I had a wife," he said, "for the first 9 years. Lucy was quiet for a moment. "What was her name?" "Clara." "That's pretty," she said. "What happened to her?" He tightened the nut on the bolt and tested the gate. It swung clean. "She died," he said. "An accident, out on the North Range." "Were you sad for a long time?" He looked at her. She was watching him with that steady, unadorned curiosity of hers, not prying, not prodding, just genuinely wanting to know, the way children ask about things before they've learned that some questions make adults uncomfortable because the truth is complicated. "Yes," he said. "Is that why you put the picture down?" He hadn't told her what the picture was. He'd forgotten somehow that she'd already solved it herself. "Yes," he said. She nodded slowly as if this confirmed a theory. "When Mama cried after Papa died," she said, "she told us that being sad about someone you loved meant that the love was real. She said that was the point of being sad. It's just love with nowhere to go." He looked at her for a moment. "She's smart," he said. "Yes," Lucy said simply. "She is." She hopped off the fence rail and picked up the old bolt he'd replaced and turned it over in her hands, examining it with the same attention she gave to most things, as if the worn-out bolt also had something to tell her if she looked carefully enough. Then she set it down on the post and walked back toward the bunkhouse, apparently satisfied with how the afternoon had gone. He picked up his tools. He stood by the gate for a minute, testing the hinge again, pressing it back and forth with his thumb. Love with nowhere to go. He put the tools away and went back to work. The first real snow came on a Saturday in mid-November, early enough to be a warning, but not so hard as to be the thing itself. It came overnight and left 8 inches on the ground, and a sky that looked like it had been considering more. Caleb was out at first light checking the livestock, testing the strength of the barn walls against the wind, walking the fence line to find any section that the weight of snow might have compromised. He was on the north fence when he heard Owen. The boy was calling from somewhere behind the barn, not frightened, just loud, with the particular volume of a child who has discovered something and wants everyone else to discover it too immediately. Caleb changed direction and came around the corner of the barn to find Owen standing knee-deep in snow, which on Owen was approximately thigh-deep, waving both arms. "Look," Owen said. He was pointing at the tracks in the snow. 3 sets, parallel, coming up from the tree line and stopping about 30 yards short of the barn. The tracks were large, clear, not dog tracks. Wolf. Caleb crouched down and looked at the nearest print. Big, bigger than a hand, the claw marks clear and deep, fresh or close to it, pressed into snow that had stopped falling only a few hours ago. "When did you come out here?" he said. "Before breakfast," Owen said. "Alone?" "Yes." Caleb stood up and looked at the tree line. Nothing moving, which didn't mean much. "Come here," he said, and picked Owen up under his arms and set him on his hip, because Owen's legs weren't long enough for what was going to be the pace back to the bunkhouse, and walked back at a speed that was deliberately unhurried, because running near a tree line you couldn't see into clearly was a specific kind of bad idea. He told Mara and Evan at breakfast. Evan leaned over the table to look at the rough sketch Caleb made of the track placement. 3 of them, he said. "At least," Caleb said. "Could be more that stayed back." "Are they dangerous?" Lucy said. "Wolves are dangerous," Caleb said, "when there's not enough food, which there isn't this winter in these hills." "So yes," Lucy said. "Yes," he confirmed. Mara had her hands around her coffee cup. She wasn't alarmed exactly, but she was alert in the way that she got when something required being thought through carefully rather than reacted to quickly. "What do we do?" "Tonight we bring the smaller animals inside the barn. The horses are already in. I'll set watches. I'll take the late one. Evan can take early evening if his arm is up to it." "My arm is fine," Evan said. "Your arm is not fine," Caleb said. "It's 6 weeks. We're on week 2. You can do the early watch and you can sit in the barn doorway with the lantern and make noise if you hear anything, but you're not going out in the field, you understand me?" Evan looked at him. It was not a look of defiance. It was the look of a boy who was trying to decide whether to argue and concluding after a moment that the argument wasn't worth the cost. "Understood," he said. "Good," Caleb said. They were quiet a moment. Then Owen said, "Can I do a watch?" "No," said Mara, Evan, Caleb, and Lucy, in more or less perfect unison. Owen looked around at all 4 of them and then looked at his biscuit. "That's 4 against 1, he said. "That's not fair." "Life's not fair," Evan told him. "Evan," Mara said. "It's true, though," he said. "It is true," Lucy agreed. Caleb looked around the table at all 4 of them, at the argument that was already developing between Owen and Evan about the fairness of democratic processes, at Lucy beginning to explain something about collective decision-making that she had apparently thought carefully about, at Mara watching her children with an expression of someone who is very tired and also very fond, and cannot always tell where one ends and the other begins. He got up and refilled his coffee. He stood at the stove and looked at his kitchen, which was full of noise and had biscuits in a cloth on the counter, and a rag rug on the floor that he could see from here because she'd brought one in from the bunkhouse after the first cold snap, saying the kitchen floor was pulling the heat out through his feet. The curtains she'd hung were moving in the small draft from the window gap he hadn't fixed yet. His coffee was good. Hutchins had come by again earlier in the week, not to talk this time, just riding past slowly in the way that some people do when they want you to know they're watching. Caleb had seen him from the fence line and turned back to work, and Hutchins had ridden on. He thought about Hutchins looking at this kitchen, at the rug and the curtains, and the biscuits and the table full of argument. He thought about what Hutchins saw and what he was wrong about in what he saw. He thought about being wrong, too. About what he'd assumed when Mara's wagon had come through his gate. About what he'd thought a family meant, which was mostly what he'd lost. Which was mostly not what this was. This was something he didn't have a name for yet. But it was working. Whatever else it was working. He drank his coffee and went back to the table. "Owen," he said, settling back into his chair. The argument stopped. Everyone looked at him. "You can do one thing during the wolf watches." Owen straightened up. "What?" "You sleep with the barn door open and you wake up if you hear anything. Can you do that?" Owen considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Yes," he said. "Then that's your job." Owen nodded, satisfied. He went back to his biscuit. Evan looked at Caleb with an expression that contained, briefly, something that might have been the beginning of a smile. Mara was looking at her coffee cup, but her shoulders had come down slightly from where they'd been. That particular tension she sometimes carried. The one that said, "I am managing more than you can see." And she looked for the moment like a woman who had found, if not rest exactly, then at least a moment where the managing could be set down without anything falling apart. The kitchen stayed noisy, the biscuits were good, the snow outside was 8 inches and the sky still looked like it had more to say. It was the middle of November in Wyoming, with wolves working their way down from the hills, and the winter hadn't even properly started. But the fire in the stove was going, and there were people around the table, and for the first time in 8 years, Caleb Thorne sat in his kitchen in the morning and did not feel the silence pressing in from every wall. The silence had been replaced by something louder, messier, and considerably harder to ignore, and he was finding, against every expectation he'd arrived at this situation with, that he wasn't sure he wanted it any other way. The wolves came back on a Wednesday. Owen heard them first. He'd been sleeping in the barn the way Caleb had arranged. His cot moved to just inside the wide door, which was left open a crack, the cold coming in off the snow in a thin, steady blade. Mara had protested the arrangement twice, and then accepted it the way she accepted most things that were out of her control, which was by making sure there were enough blankets that the thing she couldn't stop at least couldn't hurt him. It was somewhere past midnight when Owen sat up and said, not loudly but clearly, in the particular voice of a child who is more awake than asleep, "They're back." Caleb was on the late watch. He'd been sitting on an overturned crate near the barn door, a lantern at his feet turned low, a rifle across his knees, doing the thing he did on watches, which was not quite sleeping and not quite thinking, but something in between. A suspension of full attention that old ranchers developed the way sailors developed sea legs. The ability to stay alert to the specific thing that mattered while letting everything else blur. Owen's voice brought him all the way awake in about half a second. "Where?" he said, already standing. Owen pointed into the dark to the northwest. He wasn't guessing. He had the absolute directional certainty of a child who has been lying still in the dark for hours and has been listening to something work its way closer. Caleb turned up the lantern. In the near pasture, the cattle were moving. Not running, not yet, but pressed together in the far corner with the specific dense quality of animals that are sharing information with each other about where danger is. The horses in the barn had gone tight and still. He heard it then. Not a howl. Something lower, more purposeful. The sound a wolf makes when it isn't announcing itself but communicating, pack to pack, at the edge of the range where the prey is. "Stay in here," he told Owen. "I know," Owen said. He pulled the blanket to his chin and watched with enormous eyes. Caleb took the lantern and the rifle and went out into the snow. The temperature had dropped hard overnight, properly cold now, the kind that had weight to it. His breath came out in clouds. He moved along the fence line toward the northwest corner, keeping the lantern at his side rather than raised, because a raised lantern destroyed your distance vision, and he needed to see. He found the tracks at the fence, 5 sets this time. They'd been working the fence line, testing it, looking for the soft spot the way predators do, with patience and with method. One section of fence had been paced so many times the snow around it was churned to mud despite the temperature. He fired a shot into the air. The sound went out across the valley like a stone dropped in still water, and somewhere in the tree line there was movement, sudden, fast, away. He stood at the fence and listened until the sound of movement stopped. and the night went back to the specific silence that follows when a threat decides to leave. He stood there in the cold for another 10 minutes, listening. When he came back to the barn, Evan was awake and standing near Owen's cot in his coat and boots, rifle in hand, having come in from the bunkhouse at the sound of the shot. His wrist was still wrapped, but he was holding the gun correctly, one-handed, his right arm tucked against his chest. "How many?" Evan said. "5 that I counted." "Same pack?" "Probably bigger now. They're ranging down for food." Caleb set the lantern on the hook and unloaded the rifle's spent casing. "They'll be back. A single shot buys a night, maybe 2. Owen was watching both of them from his cot. "Did you see them?" he said. "No," Caleb said. "Just the tracks. Are they big?" "Big enough." Owen considered this. "I'm glad I have a job," he said, with the solemn satisfaction of someone who has contributed to a situation and knows it. Then he lay back down and pulled the blanket up and appeared to go back to sleep with the baffling ease of the very young. Evan looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Evan. "Go back to bed," Caleb said. "You sure?" "I've got it. Go." Evan went. Caleb pulled the crate back to the door, sat down, and put the rifle across his knees again, and settled back into the particular alertness that was going to see him through to morning. The real blizzard arrived on the 1st of December, and it did not arrive like weather. It arrived like a decision. The sky the day before had been the color of old iron, flat, low, not a cloud so much as a ceiling descended so far that the ridge tops disappeared into it by noon. The wind had been coming down from the north since morning with a consistency that carried information for anyone who knew how to read it. Caleb read it. He spent the afternoon doing what you do when you've lived through Wyoming winters long enough to know what that sky means. He moved every animal that could be moved into the barn, reinforced the barn doors with a diagonal brace he'd been meaning to install for 2 seasons, brought extra water into the house and the bunkhouse, and took inventory of everything consumable on the property twice. Mara did her own inventory without being asked, and they compared notes at supper. Not dramatically, just sitting at the table with 2 pieces of paper and going through them together, the way you might review a set of accounts with a business partner. The numbers were what they were. Enough food for 6 weeks if they were careful. Beyond 6 weeks, it depended on whether the supply routes had reopened by then, which depended on the storm's duration, which nobody in Wyoming in December could tell you with any certainty. 6 weeks is February, Mara said. Yes. Supply routes could be out longer than 6 weeks. Could be. She looked at the paper. Then we stretch what we have. Already planned on it. I can get more out of the stores than you'd think, she said, if I know what I'm working with. He slid his inventory page across the table. She read it the way she read everything, carefully, completely, without rushing. She made 3 small notations in the margin and slid it back. He read the notations. She'd found 3 places where the allocation could be redistributed to extend the range without hitting the threshold where people started actually going short. He hadn't seen any of them. How did you, he said. Ohio winters, she said. My mother stretched a root cellar further than you'd believe possible. You learn what's necessary. He nodded. He folded both pages together and put them in his coat pocket. Outside, the wind picked up with a sound like something large deciding to lean against the house. Tell the children to sleep in the house tonight, he said. She looked up. The main house? Bunkhouse won't hold heat in what's coming, he said. The main house has the bigger stove and the walls are thicker. The 4 of you can take the spare room and the kitchen floor. It's not comfortable, but it's warm. She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her thinking through the logistics of it. Not the propriety, which he appreciated, but the practical reality of 4 people in 2 rooms that weren't meant for that. All right, she said. The storm hit at midnight, and it was not the kind of storm that introduces itself gradually. It came in all the way, with everything it had, like it had been saving up for exactly this. The wind drove the snow sideways, and in the first hour the drifts against the north side of the barn grew to a height that would block the door by morning. By 2 in the morning, the temperature outside had dropped to a point where exposed skin would know it in under a minute. Inside the house, the stove worked. The walls held. The windows had been covered with extra cloth on the inside, Mara having done this in the last hour before the storm hit without anyone asking her to, and the cold that crept in around the frames was slowed enough that the stove could keep ahead of it. Barely, but enough. Caleb stayed up through the night. He fed the stove every hour, and he listened to the house, and he went out twice into the storm to check the barn. The second trip bad enough that he came back with ice on his beard and his fingers slow and white-tipped. And he stood over the stove for 5 minutes, pressing his hands against the iron surface and saying nothing until the feeling came back. Mara was awake when he came in from the second trip. She was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark with a candle, wrapped in a quilt, not doing anything, just awake, waiting. She looked at his hands. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine." "Sit down," she said again, in a tone that he was starting to recognize as the one that was not actually optional. He sat. She took his hands and held them between hers, which were warm from the quilt, and rubbed them in a way that was practical rather than gentle, working the blood back toward the fingers. He let her do it because the feeling was still only partially back, and because refusing would have been pointless, and because he didn't have the reserves at 3 a.m. during a blizzard to maintain the particular kind of distance he'd been maintaining. After a minute, the feeling was back, and he pulled his hands away and put them around the coffee cup she'd put in front of him without him seeing her do it. "You should sleep," he said. "I wasn't sleeping anyway," she said. She sat back down across the table. In the candlelight, she looked like someone a painting might have noticed. Not pretty in any design sense, but vivid. The way people are vivid when they're fully present and not pretending to be anywhere else. She'd been fully present every day since she arrived, and it still caught him off guard sometimes. "What happens if the storm stays for more than a week?" she said. "Then we manage," he said, "with what we have." "Yes." "What if the cattle—" "One thing at a time," he said. "The storm is the thing tonight. Everything else is tomorrow's problem." She looked at him. "You're not worried." "I'm always worried," he said. "I've just found worrying about everything at once isn't useful." She considered this. "That's practical," she said. "It's survival," he said. The wind hit the house with a sound like a wave hitting a wall, and the candle flame went sideways even through the glass. From down the hall came the brief sound of Owen murmuring in his sleep, then silence. They sat at the table for a while without talking. The stove ticked. The storm went on. At some point, she got up and put more wood in the stove, and he noticed she'd been watching the temperature of the room the same way he had, calibrating without discussion. She sat back down and pulled the quilt tighter. "Tell me something," she said. "About before." He looked at her across the table. "Before what?" "Before all of this was what it is now." She wasn't pressing. She was asking in the same way she asked things she actually wanted to know, which was directly but without urgency, like the question would wait if he needed it to. He thought about what to tell her. There was a version of before that was just the facts. The ranch, Clara, the accident, the years after. He'd told those facts before, or parts of them, to Lucy that afternoon by the fence. Facts were manageable. But Mara was asking something slightly different, and they both knew it. "I was different," he said finally. "When Clara was alive. I'm not saying better. Different, more willing to— I don't know the right word. More willing to be seen having a bad day, maybe. She was the kind of person who didn't let you pretend everything was fine when it wasn't, and after a while you stopped needing to pretend." He looked at his coffee. "When she was gone, I didn't know what to do with a bad day, so I just worked through them." "For 8 years, she said. "For 8 years. Mara was quiet for a moment. "My husband," she said, "wasn't like that. He needed things to look fine, even when they weren't, even to me." She said it without bitterness, just with the specificity of someone describing a fact they've had a long time to understand. "I never knew how much carrying I was doing until he was gone, and there was suddenly only my weight instead of both of ours, and I felt lighter than I expected to, and I didn't know what to do with that either." "That sounds lonely," he said. "It was," she said, "both during and after." She looked at the candle. "This is not lonely." He didn't say anything for a moment. The storm outside was making enough noise that the silence between them had texture to it. Not empty, not comfortable exactly, but inhabited. "No?" he said. "It isn't." The storm ran for 4 days. Not 4 days of constant whiteout. It pulsed, the way bad Wyoming storms do, easing off for a few hours in the afternoon of the second day before coming back harder the third night, as if it was giving you just enough hope to take seriously before removing it. The drifts against the barn reached the eave. The cattle, confined and stressed, burned through feed faster than the calm calculation had accounted for. By the third day, Caleb was rationing the hay in a way that made him uncomfortable, watching the cattle's ribs and doing math he didn't like. On the third morning, Evan said, "I can get to the South Hay store." The South Hay store was a secondary storage shed 30 yards from the barn that Caleb had filled in October. In good conditions, 30 yards was nothing. In current conditions, with drifts at chest height on a grown man, it was a problem. "No," Caleb said. "I can rope a line between the barn and the shed and go hand over hand," Evan said. "I've done it before, at our place. The drift along the south wall isn't as bad because of the angle of the wind. Your wrist, my left hand's fine." Caleb looked at him. The wrist had been coming along, the swelling nearly gone by now, 4 weeks in, but he hadn't told the boy that because he'd been trying to keep him off of heavy work. Looking at him now, looking at the solid assessment in his face, not bravado, not eagerness, just a practical reading of the situation, Caleb made a decision. "Show me the rope plan," he said. Together they rigged the line, Caleb going first to set the anchor on the shed, coming back along the rope in a wind that was trying sincerely to remove him from the ground. Then they went together, Caleb in front, Evan behind, hand over hand. The hay in the south store was dry, and they loaded as much as they could carry in 2 trips, and the cattle had enough feed to see through the rest of the storm. When they got back inside the barn, both of them coated in snow from collar to boot, Evan sat down on a hay bale and said, "That was bad." "Yes," Caleb said. "Worth it, though." "Yes," Caleb said again. Evan looked at the cattle moving to the hay. "My dad couldn't have done that," he said. He wasn't built for this kind of thing." He said it without apology or self-pity, just as a fact he'd arrived at and made his peace with. "I don't mean that badly." "I know," Caleb said. "I just mean..." He stopped, started again. "I'm built for this. I think. And I didn't know that until I was here." Caleb looked at him, at this 12-year-old boy who had figured out his own shape in the world and was reporting it plainly, without asking for anything from the information except acknowledgement. "You are," Caleb said, "without a doubt." Evan nodded once, the way he acknowledged things that mattered, briefly, without drawing it out. Then he got up and started spreading the hay. It was Lucy who found the water. On the 4th day of the storm, with the snow easing but the roads nowhere near passable, they ran up against a problem that Caleb had been tracking with increasing anxiety, the water situation. The house cistern was getting low. The creek that fed it had frozen solid in the first 2 days, and the snow around it was too contaminated by proximity to the cattle yard to melt safely for drinking. They had enough water for another day, maybe a day and a half, and after that it became a serious issue. Lucy had been quieter than usual during the storm days, not withdrawn, but as if she was thinking through something she hadn't finished working out. She'd spent time in the barn, in the house, walking the interior spaces of the property during the brief calmer period of the second afternoon, moving from corner to corner with her hands in her pockets and her eyes on the ground. On the 4th morning, she came into the kitchen and said, "There's water under the creek." Caleb looked up from the stove. "What?" "The creek is frozen on top," she said, "but there's a section about 20 yards upstream from where your pipe draws from. You can hear it, under the ice. It's lower than the rest of the bank, and the ice is thinner there, and I think the water's still moving underneath because it's coming from farther uphill where the ground is warmer." He looked at her. "You went to the creek." "During the calm part yesterday," she said. "I didn't go far." "Lucy." He stopped himself because what he wanted to say was the kind of thing that was correct in terms of safety and would also have been exactly wrong for this moment. "Show me where," he said instead. She showed him. She was right. The section she'd identified was a natural spring outflow that came down from the ridge, moving too fast and from deep enough in the hillside that even the 4-day freeze hadn't stopped it. The surface ice was thin enough to break through with a single strike. The water coming up from below was cold but clear and clean. They set a bucket chain, Caleb breaking the ice, Evan passing buckets, Mara relaying them to the house, Lucy and Owen responsible for the stretch between the shed and the barn door, which was sheltered. It took 2 hours, and it was miserable and cold, and nobody complained because everyone understood what it was for. That evening, with full water containers in the house, and the storm finally, genuinely finally, with the particular finality of a thing that has said everything it has to say, beginning to taper off, Caleb sat at the kitchen table and thought about the last 4 days. He thought about what had been done and who had done it. He thought about Evan on the rope line in the blizzard. He thought about Owen awake in the barn at midnight, calling out the direction of wolves, with the calm precision of a child who understood that he had a job and was doing it. He thought about Lucy walking the property in the brief calm of the second afternoon, hands in pockets, working something out in her head that she hadn't told anyone yet because she wasn't finished thinking. He thought about Mara at the table at 3 a.m, holding his hands between hers, rubbing the cold out with the unselfconscious practicality of someone who saw a thing that needed doing and did it. He'd been alone for 8 years. Not because he wanted solitude exactly, but because he hadn't been able to imagine what the alternative looked like. Because the alternative had a specific shape in his mind, the shape of what he'd had and lost, and nothing else could fit the space. He was finding out that spaces weren't as fixed as he'd thought. The day after the storm broke, the first rider came. It was Jim Reuter from the Reuter Spread, 3 miles east, which was the second smallest operation in the valley, and had always run lean even in good years. He came on foot because his horse was lame, which told Caleb something about how bad things were at the Reuter place before Reuter said a word. He was a quiet man, 50s, who'd homesteaded the East Parcel 20 years ago and had made a go of it through sheer persistence, but he looked now like persistence was running on its last reserves. "Lost 2 head," he said, standing at Caleb's gate. "Got 8 more that are going to go the same way if I can't get feed to them. My hay store didn't make it through the second night. The weight of the snow took the roof." Caleb looked at him for a moment. "Come in," he said. He fed Reuter at his kitchen table, Mara having put a plate in front of him before the second sentence was out of Reuter's mouth, without discussion, and listened to what Reuter said about conditions east of the ridge. Bad. The Kellerman family had pulled out on the second day, loaded what they could on a sled, and headed for Laramie. The Birch homestead had lost their entire chicken flock to the cold when their coop wall failed, and the Perrin family, the same Perrins who had apparently stopped speaking to Mara at the trading post, were down to 3 days of food and had a sick child and a husband with a broken leg, sustained before the storm when he'd gone down on the ice. Reuter said all of this with the careful, understated delivery of someone who is describing things that are bad without wanting to be seen, asking for help directly. And Caleb heard both the information and the thing underneath the information. "How much hay do you need to see your cattle through?" Caleb said. Reuter named a number. Caleb did math. "I can give you half that from the South store, Sec," he said. "It'll put me short, but not critical." Reuter looked at the table. "I don't have anything to pay you with right now." "I'm not asking for payment," Caleb said. Reuter looked up. "Spring," Caleb said. "You help me with the north fence expansion. That's it." Reuter nodded. The nod of a man who is relieved and ashamed of being relieved in equal measure. After Reuter left, with Evan having helped him load the hay onto the handcart the man had dragged 3 miles through the snow, Mara came and stood next to Caleb at the barn door, and they both watched Reuter working his way back down the road. "The Perrins," Mara said. "I know," he said. "She was one of the ones who—" "I know," he said. "She was quiet. Does that change things?" He looked at her. "No," he said, simply. "It doesn't." She nodded slowly, and something in her face settled. Not surprise, because he didn't think she'd actually expected a different answer, but the confirmation of something she'd been wanting to be true and hadn't been entirely certain of. "I'll put together what they can use from the kitchen stores," she said. "Take Evan with the sled," he said. "I'll go to the Birch place first." They spent 3 days working the valley. It was not organized, not at first. It was Caleb going from one struggling property to the next, assessing what was needed and delivering what he could from what he had, and then coming home and going out again. Mara managed the home resources with the precision of someone who understood exactly where every edge was, extending the stores in ways that should not have been mathematically possible but were, because she understood things about cooking under constraint that weren't in any book and couldn't be explained as anything other than hard-won knowledge. On the second day of this, he came back to find that 2 families had come to him. The Kellermans, who he'd thought had left for Laramie, had turned back, They'd made it only 8 miles before conditions made the road impassable, and they'd waited out the worst of it in a cold camp and come back because going forward was impossible and staying in the road was dying. They were at his gate when he got home. A husband and wife and 2 teenage boys, all of them white-faced with cold and saying almost nothing. He opened the gate and brought them in. That night his house had 9 people in it. He stood in his kitchen doorway and looked at what his kitchen had become. Every surface in use, the stove running at full capacity, Mara moving between it and the table with the focus of someone who has been given a complex problem and intends to solve it, Lucy helping with a competence that had developed steadily over the past month, Owen carrying things from the pantry with the gravity of official duty. The Kellerman boys, 16 and 14, ranch-built, accustomed to work, had been put to use by Evan before Caleb had said a word about it. Evan having apparently identified immediately what needed doing and organized accordingly. Caleb had watched that happen from the barn door with an expression on his face that he couldn't have described, but that Margaret Danner, had she seen it, would have recognized immediately. It was the expression of a man watching something he built working the way it was supposed to. The parents came on the 3rd day. They came because they had no choice. Their food was gone, the husband couldn't walk, and the child had a fever that had been climbing for 2 days. They came in a sled pulled by the one horse that had survived the storm, and they came knowing what the pair and wife had done at the trading post, knowing the words that had been said about Mara Ellison and Caleb Thorne and the arrangement at Black Ridge Ranch, and they came anyway because their child was sick and they were out of options. Caleb was at the gate when they arrived. He didn't say anything about what had been said. He opened the gate and helped the pair and husband down from the sled and sent for Mara to look at the child. Mara took the child inside. She didn't say anything about the trading post either. Later, much later, when the child's fever had come down and the pair and husband had been seen by Doc Riley, who had come out from town when the road allowed, and the pair and wife was sitting at Caleb's kitchen table with a cup of coffee warming her hands, the woman said quietly, "I don't know how to—" "You don't have to," Mara said. The woman looked at her. "You don't have to," Mara said again, not unkindly. "You needed help, and we had it. That's the end of it." It wasn't the end of it. They both knew that, the way you know that some things said cannot be entirely unset by a single act of grace, no matter how genuine. But it was as close to the end of it as practicality and human limitation allowed, and Mara was, above all things, practical. By the end of the 3rd day, there were 4 families at Black Ridge Ranch. Most of the valley's surviving livestock consolidated in the expanded barn and the shed, and a system in place that Caleb had not planned or designed, but that had built itself out of necessity and the particular character of the people involved. Hutchins had not come. Caleb had noted the absence. He sat on his porch the evening of the 3rd day, the cold sharp and clean after the storm's departure, the sky clear for the first time in a week, and the stars out in that particular Wyoming winter density that looked too many to be real. Evan came and stood beside him, looking at the same sky. "Are you going to go to Hutchins?" Evan said. "No," Caleb said. "Why not?" "Because he knows where we are," Caleb said. "If he needs help, he knows where to come." Evan thought about this. What if his pride won't let him? "Then that's the choice he made," Caleb said. "I can't make it for him." Evan was quiet for a moment. The distant sound of one of the Kellerman boys working the barn, a rhythmic creak of the water pump, carried across the yard. From inside the house came the sound of voices, several of them overlapping in the particular way of people who are crowded together and have gotten past the first awkwardness of it. "My dad would have gone to him anyway," Evan said. Caleb looked at him. "Just to say so," Evan said. "He was like that." He paused. "I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying." Caleb looked back at the sky. He thought about what the boy had said. He thought about what it meant to say a thing to someone like Hutchins, what it cost and what it might return, and whether the arithmetic of it was worth doing. "Get your coat," he said. "We'll go tomorrow morning." Evan looked at him. "Yeah?" "If you're going to say something like that," Caleb said, "say it like you mean it." The boy went inside to get his coat, and Caleb stayed on the porch a little longer, looking at the clear, cold sky over the valley that had just survived something that had come very close to breaking it, and thinking about the difference between the kind of man who waits for people to come to him and the kind of man who goes. He was not entirely sure standing there which kind of man he was becoming, but he was beginning to think the question was worth asking. They went to Hutchins the next morning, Caleb and Evan, on horseback because the road was passable now if you stayed to the center where the wind had scoured the snow down to something a horse could manage. The Hutchins spread was the largest in the valley, or had been, before the storm. What Caleb saw when they rode through the gate was not what the largest spread in the valley was supposed to look like. The main barn had lost a section of its east wall. The timber split under the snow load and collapsed inward. Two of the near paddocks were empty in a way that said the animals that had been in them were gone, not moved. The yard had the look of a place where work had stopped and not yet restarted. The particular frozen stillness of a property that had taken a blow and hadn't figured out how to respond. Hutchins was at the woodpile when they rode up. He was splitting wood with the mechanical quality of a man who is doing a physical thing because standing still would be worse, and he didn't stop when he heard the horses. He drove the maul down twice more before he looked up. He looked older, not in any dramatic way, just in the way that a bad week and a bad storm and a bad accounting of losses could add years to a face in the time it took the snow to fall. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Evan. He didn't say anything. Caleb got down off his horse. "Dale," he said. "Caleb." Hutchins set the maul against the woodpile. He looked at the boy and something moved briefly in his face. "That the Ellison boy?" "Evan," Evan said from his horse. Hutchins nodded slowly. He was a man who had built his self-conception around being the person other people came to, and he was now standing in his own yard receiving visitors who had arrived not to ask anything of him, but to offer something, and the reconfiguration of that dynamic was visibly costing him something. Caleb had enough experience with pride to recognize what it looked like when someone was fighting it. "East wall of the barn," Caleb said, looking at the collapsed section. "I see it every morning," Hutchins said. "How much did you lose?" A pause, the kind of pause that is about more than finding the words. 7 head of cattle, Hutchins said. 4 in the collapse. 3 more after. They were exposed too long. And my winter hay store is at about 1/3 of what I calculated going in. He looked somewhere past Caleb's shoulder, at the middle distance where men look when they're delivering information they don't want to be delivering. My 2 ranch hands left the second day of the storm, said they were going to Laramie and they'd come back in spring. He stopped. I don't know if they'll come back. Caleb let that sit for a moment. You should have come to us, he said. I know that, Hutchins said. The admission was flat, not apologetic, just the acknowledgement of a fact. I'm not saying it to make a point, Caleb said. I know you're not. Hutchins looked at him directly for the first time since they'd ridden up. That's not why it's hard to hear. Caleb understood that. He understood it well enough that he didn't push at it. I've got 4 families at the ranch right now, he said. Reuter, the Kellermans, the Birch family, the Perrins. We've been pooling what we have. It's working because the combined resources are more than any one of us had separately. He looked at the empty paddocks, the broken barn wall, the woodpile that Hutchins had been attacking with a maul because he needed something to fight. I'm asking you to come in. Hutchins was quiet for a long moment. A wind moved through the yard and lifted a small spray of snow from the drift against the fence and dispersed it. What does coming in mean? Hutchins said. It means you bring your cattle to the consolidated herd at Black Ridge. It means your labor contributes to the group work, and the group work comes to you. It means the food stores are shared on a needs basis and repaid in kind or in labor come spring. Caleb paused. It means you don't try to ride this out alone, which you're not going to be able to do, and I think you know that. Another silence. Hutchins looked at his yard. He looked at the barn wall. I said things, he said, about you. And about... He glanced briefly toward Evan. About the arrangement. You said them, Caleb said. That's done. This is now. Hutchins turned the maul over in his hands. He was a man who had spent his adult life being the authority in every room he was in, and what he was being asked to do was walk into a room where the authority had been built by someone else and trust it. That was not a small thing for a man like Hutchins. All right, he said. All right, Caleb said. Hutchins looked at Evan, who had been sitting his horse through all of this with the quiet watchfulness that was becoming, Caleb thought. as natural to the boy as breathing. "You ride well," Hutchins said. "My mother taught me," Evan said. Something that was nearly a smile crossed Hutchins's face and didn't quite make it all the way. "That figures," he said, in a tone that had lost most of its edge. Then he went to get his coat. The proposal, if it could be called that, being less a formal proposal and more a practical reality that Caleb gave a name to at the right moment, happened 3 days after Hutchins arrived. They were in Caleb's barn, 7 adults from the 5 families, standing among consolidated livestock in the particular close warmth of a crowded barn in winter. And the conversation had reached the point that conversations among practical people under pressure always eventually reach. The point where someone has to say what everyone is already thinking. Caleb said it. "We need a system," he said. "Not just for now. Through March, maybe into April if the roads stay bad. A system where everybody knows what they're contributing and what they're getting back, and where the decisions about the combined resources are made by everyone together." He laid out what he had in mind. It was not complicated because he didn't believe in complicated when simple would work. Shared livestock management. The cattle of all 5 families treated as one herd, fed from a common store, maintained by rotating labor. Shared food resources, not equally divided, but allocated by need, with Mara overseeing the kitchen operation because she was the best person for it, and everyone present already knew it, including Hutchins, who said nothing when Caleb named her. Shared security. Night watches rotated among all men capable of doing them, which now included the 2 Kellerman boys, who were 16 and 14 and both capable. Shared labor on the properties that needed the most immediate work, beginning with Hutchins' barn wall, because a broken barn wall in January was everyone's problem, whether the cattle inside it were Hutchins or not. He laid it out and he stopped talking and looked around the barn. Reuter said, "I'm in." The Kellerman husband nodded. Birch took a little longer. He was a man who thought carefully before committing, which Caleb respected. Then he said, "How do we handle disputes if there's a disagreement about allocation or labor?" "We talk it out," Caleb said. "All of us. Majority decides." "And if the majority is wrong?" "Then the majority is wrong, and we deal with the consequences together," Caleb said. "That's what together means." Birch considered this. "Fair enough," he said. Everyone looked at Hutchins. Hutchins was leaning against the barn wall with his arms crossed, looking at the floor. He had the expression of a man running numbers, not the arithmetic of resources, which he'd already done, but the more complex calculation of what this arrangement meant for the position he'd held in this valley for 15 years. Being the largest operation had meant being the authority. Being brought into an arrangement as an equal, or more accurately, as one voice among many on a ranch that wasn't his, was a different thing entirely. He looked up. "The decision-making," he said to Caleb. "You're not putting yourself above it." "No," Caleb said. "You're one vote." "Same as you," Caleb said. "Same as Reuter. Same as Birch." Hutchins was quiet for another moment. Then he uncrossed his arms. "All right," he said, "but I want it written down. What everyone contributes and what everyone gets back. I don't do handshake agreements." "Neither do I," Caleb said. "Mara keeps the accounts." Hutchins looked briefly at the barn door, at the house beyond it, where Mara was at the stove managing a kitchen that was now feeding 11 people 3 times a day. He looked back at Caleb. He nodded. "Then we're agreed," Caleb said. They were agreed. Draw it. Mara wrote it down that evening, at the kitchen table, with 4 of the other adults present. She wrote the names of every family, what they'd brought in terms of livestock and stores, what the current combined total was, and a projected allocation schedule that went through to the end of March. She wrote it in the same small, precise hand she wrote everything, and when she was done, she passed it around the table and every person who could read read it, and every person who couldn't had it read to them, and they all agreed to it, and Hutchins signed it first without being asked, which Caleb thought was the most useful thing the man had done since his arrival. The agreed system was imperfect in practice, the way all agreed systems are. The first real friction came from the Kellerman boys. They were good workers, both of them, but they were also teenage boys sharing close quarters with people they didn't know well after a week of stress and cold and insufficient sleep. And on the 5th day, the older one, his name was Carl, 16, with his father's wide frame and his mother's quicker temper, Got into an argument with Evan over the order of the morning chores that went from a disagreement to something louder in about 4 exchanges. Caleb heard it from the paddock. He came into the barn to find Carl at full volume and Evan at controlled volume, which in Caleb's experience meant Evan was angrier than Carl, just better at not showing it, which was a more dangerous state than Carl's version. "You don't run this place," Carl was saying. "I didn't say I run it," Evan said. "I said the horses need water before the cattle because the horses are closer to the pump and the line is shorter. That's just how it works faster." "Oh, we always did cattle first at our place." "This isn't your place," Evan said. That was the wrong thing to say, and everyone in the barn, including Evan, knew it a half-second after it left his mouth. Caleb walked between them, not pushing anyone, just occupying the space between them, which was enough. He looked at Carl. "He's right about the horses and the pump," he said. "It's a practical matter, not a rank matter. Water horses first because the line's shorter and we get through it faster." He looked at Evan. "And he's a guest on this property, and you'll speak to him like one." Evan looked at the floor. "Yes, sir," he said. Carl looked surprised, not at the correction of Evan, but at the sir, and at what the sir said about how Evan thought about Caleb and what that meant. He stood down from where he'd been a moment ago. "Horses first," Carl said, and picked up the water pail. Evan picked up the other one. They didn't speak for the rest of the morning, but they worked efficiently and in parallel, and by the afternoon there was a functional piece between them that had something in it that might, given enough time, become something better. Later, Caleb told Mara about it. She was at the table with the accounts, the same way she was most evenings. She listened without looking up from the page. When he finished, she said, "He called you sir." "He did," Caleb said. "Does that mean something to you?" He thought about how to answer that. It meant more than he was prepared to say directly. "It means he's a good kid," he said. She looked up from the paper. She looked at him for a moment with that reading the room quality she had, that way of seeing more than was being offered. "Yes," she said. "He is." She looked back at the paper. "So are you, Caleb, for what it's worth." He didn't have an answer for that. He got up and went to bed, and he lay there for a while looking at the ceiling and thinking about what it meant to be called a good man by someone whose judgment he'd come to trust more than almost anyone's. The cattle thieves came in the second week of January. They came at night, the way they always did, and they came knowing what they were coming to, which meant they'd been watching, long enough to know that the ranch's consolidated herd was the largest collection of cattle in the valley, and therefore the most valuable target available. 3 men, mounted, moving along the north fence in the dark, with the quiet professional efficiency of people who had done this before and knew how to do it without generating the kind of noise that woke people up. Owen woke up. Owen, who had spent every night since the wolf watches in the barn with the door cracked, who had been sleeping with one functional part of his small brain always slightly on, the way he'd been doing it for weeks now, heard the horses on the north side at, Caleb would later calculate, around 2 in the morning, and heard something in the pattern of their movement that was different from the ranch's own horses and different from wolves. He didn't know exactly what it was. He knew it was wrong. He went to Caleb's room. He knocked 3 times, quick, the same knock Lucy used. Caleb was awake in 2 seconds. "Horses," Owen said. "North fence, but they're not ours." Caleb was out of bed and had his boots and his rifle before Owen finished the sentence. He woke Evan first, then went to the bunkhouse for the Kellerman boys, then to Reuter's room. He didn't make noise about it. No shouting, no running. He moved through the dark house and the dark yard and distributed people to positions the way he'd thought about a dozen times since the families arrived, because the possibility of exactly this had been in the back of his mind from the beginning. Carl Kellerman, who turned out to be a cooler head in crisis than his temper suggested, took the east approach. Reuter and the younger Kellerman boy covered the south, cutting off the route back toward the road. Evan, his wrist healed now, 4 weeks past Doc Riley's 6-week mark, though nobody had formally declared it, went with Caleb to the north fence. They got there before the thieves finished cutting the wire. There were 3 of them, as Caleb had assessed from the tracks. They were working the fence at the 2-post gap where the wire was oldest, and they were almost through it, and the near cattle were already beginning to drift toward the opening with the animal logic that says an open space is a space to walk through. Caleb fired once into the air. The three men froze. In the lantern light, Evan had the lantern, held low. Caleb could see them clearly enough. Two young, one not. The not young one had the look of someone who'd made these calculations many times and was running them again now, assessing the ratio of risk to reward, deciding whether the people at the fence with rifles were real opposition or theater. "I've got men on the south and east," Caleb said conversationally, because panic never helped and quiet authority often did. "You've got one way left open, and it's the one you came in on. I'd suggest you use it." The not young man looked at him. He looked at Evan. He looked at the cattle already drifting back from the wire gap, disturbed by the shot. "Nothing here worth dying for," Caleb said. The man turned his horse. The two younger ones followed without a word. They went back through the tree line, and the sound of their horses' hooves on the frozen ground diminished and then disappeared, and the night went back to its cold, ordinary silence. Evan let out a breath. "Good," Caleb said. "That's it?" Evan said. "What did you want?" Evan thought about it. "I don't know, he said. Something that felt more like a resolution. "This is what a resolution looks like most of the time," Caleb said. "Nobody got hurt. The cattle are still here. That's the resolution." He put the rifle over his shoulder and started back toward the fence to assess the wire damage. "Help me patch this." Evan came and held the wire while Caleb worked the splice, and they did the repair by lantern light in the cold. Working with the wordless efficiency they'd developed over months of working side by side, each knowing what the other needed without having to ask. When they were done, Evan said, "Do you think they'll come back?" "Probably not," Caleb said. "Men who do this work don't reapproach a target that's defended. Too many easier ones elsewhere." He tested the splice. "Solid. But we keep the watches." "Right," Evan said. They walked back across the yard. The other men were already coming in from their positions, Reuter stamping cold feet, the younger Kellerman boy looking slightly disappointed that there hadn't been more to it, Carl looking carefully neutral in the way he'd been looking since the barn argument, which was the look of a boy working on something in himself. Hutchins was standing at the barn door. He hadn't been assigned a position. Caleb hadn't had time to include him in the deployment, and Hutchins had made his own decision about where to be. He'd been covering the barn from inside, which was exactly the right call. He had his rifle. He looked at Caleb and said nothing. Caleb looked at him. "Good call," Caleb said. "Being in the barn." Hutchins nodded once. "Cattle were the target," he said. "Made sense." "Yes, it did," Caleb said. Something passed between them. Not friendship, not yet, and maybe not ever exactly, but something that was the foundation that friendship might be built on. Given time and enough shared cold nights standing guard over cattle, neither of them could afford to lose. They went inside. The weeks that followed had a quality to them that Caleb had not expected and could not entirely account for. He had anticipated that the consolidated arrangement would be functional. He had not anticipated that it would be, in its odd, crowded, imperfect way, good. Not good in the sense of easy. The disagreements continued, over labor allocation, over how to handle a sick cow that two families had different opinions about, over whose fence repair came first when there wasn't enough wire for all of them in the same week. Hutchins was difficult in ways that were consistent with being Hutchins. The Birch husband was a worrier in ways that required regular management. The Kellerman wife and the Perrin wife had a friction between them whose origin Caleb never fully tracked down, but that required occasional navigation. But they fed everyone. The cattle came through, the wolves circled but didn't breach. The barn wall at the Hutchins place got rebuilt in 3 days of combined labor that would have taken Hutchins alone 3 weeks. And the thing that surprised Caleb most, the thing he turned over in his head in the evenings when the house was finally quiet enough to think, was the children. Not just his children, the ones he'd stopped thinking of as Mara's children and started thinking of as his own in a way he'd never made a deliberate decision about. But all the children. Owen had taken to following the Birch family's 6-year-old with the same loyal shadow energy he'd once reserved exclusively for Caleb, and the two of them had constructed some kind of elaborate ongoing game in the hayloft that nobody fully understood, but that seemed to generate more genuine joy per square foot than anything else on the property. Lucy had appointed herself as a kind of unofficial teacher to the younger Kellerman boy, who was behind in his reading, delivering instruction with the same precise gravity she brought to everything, and the boy was actually learning. Evan had worked out something with Carl Kellerman that had started as mutual tolerance and become, by February, something that looked a lot like real friendship. They worked together without talking much, which was exactly how Evan preferred things, and Carl had apparently figured that out. Mara watched all of this from the kitchen with the expression of someone who has seen something she'd hoped for but hadn't let herself expect. Caleb watched her watching it and thought about what hope looked like when it turned out to have been right. On a Saturday in mid-February, two things happened that pulled the season toward its end. The first was that the road to town opened, partially, not fully passable. A man on horseback could make it, but a wagon would have trouble. But open enough that Reuter rode in on a Thursday and came back with news and mail and the information that Doc Riley said the worst of it was over, that the supply lines from Laramie were moving again, that the world outside the valley was still there and operational. The second thing was what Hutchins said at supper. He'd been eating his meals at Caleb's table since the second week, by default, his own kitchen arrangements being impractical with the Kellerman family in his guest room. He'd been quiet at most of these meals, which was not his natural state and which everyone noticed but nobody commented on. He ate, he contributed when a practical question came up. He left. It was Hutchins at the furthest reduction of himself, stripped of the context in which he was always the largest person in the room. On this Saturday at supper, he said to Mara, "This is the best cooking I've eaten in 20 years. The table went quiet for a moment. Not an uncomfortable quiet, more the quiet of people who are surprised and want to hear what comes next. Mara looked at him. "Thank you, Dale," she said. "I mean it," Hutchins said, in a tone that made clear he understood the significance of saying it, and had decided to say it anyway. "And I mean all of it. What you've done here, with the kitchen and the stores." He paused. "I was wrong about what you were," he said. "Both of you." He looked at Caleb and then back at Mara. "I want that said." "It's said," Mara said. "I'd like it accepted." She looked at him for a long moment. "It's accepted," she said. Hutchins nodded. He went back to his supper. Lucy looked at Owen across the table, and Owen looked back at Lucy, and some silent communication passed between them that resulted in both of them looking back at their plates with the expression of people who are being appropriately reserved about something they find very interesting. Caleb refilled his coffee. He looked around his table, at 11 people eating a meal that shouldn't have been possible on the resources they had, in a house that had been empty and silent 8 years ago and had been invaded by noise and children and difficulty and unexpected grace. He looked at Mara. She was cutting bread at the counter, her back to the table. He watched the efficiency of her hands, the way she moved in his kitchen as naturally as she moved anywhere, with the same competence and the same absence of performance that she brought to everything. She had a flour smudge on her left sleeve. Her hair was loose again. He'd stopped noticing when that had happened, when she'd gone from being someone he was watching because he needed to understand what he'd agreed to someone he was watching because he just did, the way you watch something that you've quietly decided you don't want to stop looking at. She turned around with the bread and caught him looking and looked back, and there was a moment, brief, not long enough to require anything from either of them, where they were just two people in a kitchen at the end of a long day, looking at each other. Then Owen knocked over his cup and the moment was over, replaced by the ordinary chaos of children and spilled milk, and Lucy explaining to Owen how cups worked, and Caleb got up to get the cloth. But the moment had happened. He knew it had happened, and so did she. He could tell by the small particular way she didn't look at him for the next 5 minutes, which was itself a form of attention. The snow began retreating in the last week of February, slowly, the way Wyoming winter does. Not gracefully, not all at once, but in stages, each warm afternoon reclaiming a few inches from the drifts, the creek beginning to be audible again under its ice, the first patches of bare ground appearing on the south-facing slopes like the beginning of an argument being made. The families began making arrangements to return to their own properties. The Kellermans went first. Their place was the closest to functional, their losses manageable in the way that careful people's losses tend to be. They left on a Monday morning, Carl shaking Evan's hand with a directness that suggested the 2 weeks left before that moment had built something real enough to be demonstrated without embarrassment. Reuter went next, with the hay he'd been promised and the understanding about the spring fence work, shaking Caleb's hand at the gate with the quiet of a man who knows he owes something that can't be paid entirely in labor. Birch went on a Wednesday. The parents left Thursday, the husband on a borrowed crutch, the child healthy and pink and running for the wagon with the energy of a recovered child who has no patience for the pace of recovering adults. The pair and wife stopped at the gate. She looked at Mara, who was standing on the porch. She opened her mouth and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I'll be at the trading post. If you're ever—" She stopped. "You'll be at the trading post," she said instead, which was a different sentence but said what needed saying. "I will," Mara said. The parents left. Then it was Hutchins. He came to the barn to collect his horse. The cattle had already been driven back to his property the day before, Evan and Carl making a final joint operation of it, and he stood in the barn door with his coat buttoned and his hat in his hand and looked at Caleb. "I'll have my men start on the shared fence come April," he said. "April's fine," Caleb said. "And there's a stretch of my north pasture that could run another 30 head if the graze comes in right this spring," Hutchins said. "More than I need. I thought if you were looking to expand the herd." Caleb looked at him. This was a different kind of offer from Hutchins than anything that had come before. Not charity, not apology, but a proposition between men who had arrived at a different understanding of each other than the one they'd started with. "I'd want it on paper," Caleb said. "Obviously," Hutchins said, "and Mara keeps the accounts on it." A pause. A shorter pause than it would have been 2 months ago. "Obviously," Hutchins said again, and put his hat on. He extended his hand. Caleb shook it. Hutchins rode out. Caleb stood at the barn door and watched him go, and thought about the distance between the man who had ridden up to this gate in October to deliver his opinions about widows and children and what a real ranch looked like, and the man who had just ridden away with a handshake agreement and a commitment to shared work come spring. People could change, not completely, not easily, not without something that cost them something real, but they could. He thought about himself, standing at this gate 8 years ago, then a year ago, then 3 months ago when an old wagon had come up the road. He could too, apparently. The night the last family left, the house went quiet for the first time in 2 months. Not the old quiet, not the 8 years quiet that had weight and texture and pressed in from every wall. This was different. It was the quiet of a house with 4 people in it who had all gone to their rooms at the end of a long day, and the quiet between them was inhabited rather than empty. Caleb sat at the kitchen table. He didn't know how long he sat there. Long enough that the fire in the stove burned down from active to holding, the particular orange of well-established coals. He had his hands around a coffee cup that had gone cold, and he was thinking about the spring, which was visible now in the way that things become visible when enough of what was blocking them has been cleared away. He was thinking about what he wanted the spring to look like. He'd been alone long enough that the habit of only making plans for one had become automatic, invisible, the thing you don't notice because it never occurs to you to do otherwise. Now he sat in the kitchen with the cold coffee and thought about spring, and it wasn't a solitary picture. It had never been, he realized, not since about 3 weeks into October. At some point, the picture had quietly reorganized itself to include 4 other people, and it had done this without his permission, and he hadn't noticed because he'd been busy with wolves and blizzards and cattle thieves and the arithmetic of feeding 11 people on 6 people's stores. The kitchen floor had a rug on it. There were curtains on the window. The wall in his room had a different picture now. Not the photograph from the bottom drawer, not yet, but a drawing that Lucy had made of the ranch in November, recognizable if not precisely accurate, with a sun in the corner drawn with the particular sun style of a child who hasn't learned to be self-conscious about drawing suns, and he'd put it up without entirely deciding to. He got up and went down the hall and knocked on the door at the end, 2 knocks, and waited. Mara said, "Come in." She was sitting on the edge of her bed in the lamplight, still dressed, her boots on the floor beside her. She had the account ledger open on her knee, not reading it, just holding it. She looked like someone who had also been sitting with something she hadn't finished thinking through. He leaned against the doorframe. He didn't go in. He stayed at the threshold, which felt like the right place to be for what he was about to say. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" she said. He looked at the wall over her shoulder, then at her. "About what this is," he said, "or what it's been becoming." She was very still. Not tense, not braced, the way people get when they're afraid of what comes next. Just still, in the particular way of someone who has been waiting for a thing to be said, and is giving it room to be set in. I know what it was supposed to be, he said. The arrangement. You cook, I provide board. That's what we agreed to. He paused. That's not what it's been for a while. No, she said. It hasn't. I'm 45 years old, he said. I'm not going to pretend I have a graceful way to say this. I don't need graceful, she said. He looked at her directly. I don't want you to work for me anymore, he said. I want you to stay. And I want it to be a different thing than it's been, but I don't know how to ask for that exactly, because I've been alone long enough that I'm not sure I know the language for it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You just used it. He looked at her. The language, she said. You just used it. She set the ledger on the nightstand. I'm not good at graceful either, she said. I have 3 children and an opinion about everything, and I've been told I work too hard and don't rest enough, and I'm not the easiest person to live with. I know all of that, he said. I know you do, she said. I'm saying it so we're clear. We're clear, he said. She looked at him in the lamplight. She had the tired, vivid, fully present look she always had, the look he'd stopped thinking of as tiredness and started thinking of as just Mara, the way she occupied a room, the way she occupied a conversation without performance or apology. Yes, she said. He'd asked a question without quite finishing it, and she'd answered it anyway, which was exactly like her, and he found that he was not surprised by either the answer or the method of delivery. All right, he said. All right, she said. He stayed at the doorframe for another moment, not because he needed to, but because the moment seemed worth not ending prematurely. Then he said goodnight and went back to his room and lay on his bed in the dark, looking at the ceiling, and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the future was not something to be managed, but something to be moved toward. Outside, the snow was still retreating. The creek was audible. The south slopes were showing ground. Spring was coming the way it always came, imperfectly, slowly, not all at once, but coming. Spring came to Black Ridge the way it always came to that part of Wyoming. Not as an arrival so much as a slow negotiation between what winter was willing to give back and what the land was willing to reclaim. The creek unfroze fully in the second week of March, not all at once, but section by section, the ice softening to the particular gray of something that has made its decision but hasn't finished acting on it. The south pasture showed green by the third week. Not much, not the thick grays of June, but enough that the cattle could be moved out of the barn consolidation and onto the land, which they did with the enthusiastic chaos of animals that had been waiting a long time for exactly that. Evan managed the move with Carl Kellerman, who rode over from his family's place to help without being asked, which said something about what the winter had built between them that neither of them would have been able to articulate, and neither of them needed to. The ranch changed shape in spring, not just the physical shape of it, though that changed too, as Caleb and Reuter began the north fence expansion they'd agreed to, driving posts into ground that was still half frozen and arguing companionably about the right depth for this particular soil. But the shape of what it was for, what it held, what moved through it, and what stayed. Mara stayed. They had not made a formal announcement of anything. They didn't hold a meeting about it or send word ahead to the trading post. They simply continued being what they'd been becoming since the night in February when Caleb had stood in a doorway and said the imprecise necessary thing, and she had answered it with a yes that meant more than the word contained. They ate at the same table and worked the same land and made decisions together about the ranch the way people do when they've stopped pretending that their lives are separate operations running in parallel. Margaret Danner figured it out the second time Mara came into the trading post in March. And Caleb came in 20 minutes later, and the two of them conducted what was clearly a single shopping operation while maintaining the mild fiction of having arrived independently. Margaret said nothing, which was its own form of commentary, and which Caleb appreciated. Lucy figured it out sometime in February and didn't say anything either, which was unusual enough for Lucy that Caleb took it as a sign that she understood it mattered and was treating it accordingly. She did, however, bring him a second drawing for his wall, this one of the family at the supper table, rendered in the same forthright style as the first, with himself included at the head of it, which had been her decision and not anyone's suggestion, and which he put up without discussion in the place where the blank wall had been. Owen figured it out when Caleb said yes to something Owen asked without first checking with Mara. And Mara walked in from the other room and said yes to the same thing, which Owen took as incontrovertible evidence that the two adults in question were operating as a unit. He reported this finding to Lucy that evening as breaking news. Lucy told him she'd known for months. Owen said that wasn't fair. Lucy explained that being observant was a skill that required practice. Owen said he'd been busy with other things. Lucy said that was probably true. Evan figured it out and said nothing and went on working, which was the most Evan response possible. The wedding happened in April. It was not a large or elaborate affair, not by any measure that would have impressed a city. It happened on a Saturday on the front porch of the ranch house, with the valley spread out below them, still showing the ragged edges of its winter damage. The Hutchins barn wall rebuilt, but obviously new against the weathered gray of the rest of it. The fence lines showing fresh posts here and there, where the old ones hadn't survived. The creek running high with snowmelt and carving new small channels in the soft ground of the near pasture. The people who came were the people who had spent the winter in each other's company, which was most of the valley, and they came the way people come to a thing that has earned the right to be celebrated. Not out of obligation, but out of genuine feeling about what the occasion represented, which was bigger than just two people making a decision about their lives. Reuter was there. The Kellermans came. Carl shook Evan's hand again at the gate, and this time there was no stiffness in it. The Birch family came, and the Perrin wife came with her husband, who was walking without the crutch now, and their child, who ran for Owen immediately because they had continued the hayloft game by proxy over the winter and had a great deal of catching up to do. Hutchins came. He arrived alone, on his best horse, dressed in the clothes he wore to occasions he considered important, and he stood at the back of the gathered people on the porch, with his hat in his hands, and watched the proceeding with the expression of a man attending something that is costing him nothing but his pride, which is a very specific and instructive cost. The man who performed the ceremony was the justice of the peace from town, who read the legal words that made a thing official and then stepped back, because the legal words were not the point. The point was Caleb Thorne standing on his porch in April, cleaned up as well as a 45-year-old rancher was going to get cleaned up, saying to Mara Ellison what needed to be said in front of the people who needed to hear it. He was not good with words. He told her that going in, and she told him that she didn't need good words, she needed true ones. So he said the true ones plainly, without embellishment. He said that she had walked onto his property in October with 3 children and a list and had proceeded to make his house into something he hadn't known he was missing. He said he was not easy to live with and that he knew it, and that she'd managed it anyway with a combination of competence and stubbornness that he found, if he was being honest, more attractive than any easier quality would have been. He said he intended to spend the rest of his life trying to be worth what she'd offered him by staying. Mara stood across from him in the dress she'd made herself from cloth that Margaret Danner had set aside for her in January before anyone had officially said anything, because Margaret Danner had eyes and an opinion and had acted on both. And the dress was not fancy, but it was exactly right, and she looked at Caleb the way she looked at most things, directly, completely, without performance, and said what she needed to say. She said she hadn't come to Black Ridge looking for what she'd found here. She said she'd come because she'd needed somewhere to land and had chosen this place because the notice on the post had sounded like a man who was lonely without knowing how to say so, and she'd understood that quality because she'd had it herself. She said she'd stayed because of him, and because the land had a character to it that matched something in her own, and because her children had found something here that she hadn't been able to give them alone, which was the thing she hadn't known how to ask for, and which had been given anyway. She said she would argue with him regularly and manage the accounts and make the decisions about the kitchen without consulting him because the kitchen was hers, and he knew it, and she intended to be difficult and present and entirely here for the duration. He said that was exactly what he was counting on. The people on the porch and in the yard laughed, and the laughter was the genuine warm kind that happens when a room full of people recognize something true. And then the justice of the peace said the final words, and it was done. Owen, who had been standing between Lucy and Evan throughout, said, finally, loud enough that several people near him heard it, which made the laughter start again. And Lucy told him in a whisper that he didn't have any sense of occasion, and Owen said he had plenty of occasion. He just also had an opinion. And Evan put a hand on the back of Owen's neck and steered him gently in the direction of the food table, which was an effective redirection. The notice came down from Danner's trading post in May, not by anyone's request. Margaret Danner took it down herself, because it had been up since October, and the paper had weathered past the point of legibility, and because, she said when Caleb came in for supplies the week after, the situation it had been advertising was no longer available. She handed it to him across the counter. He looked at it. The paper had gone brown and soft at the edges. The ink faded to something you had to know was there to read. Cook wanted. Black Ridge Ranch. No conversation required. He looked at it for a moment. He thought about the man who had written those words, who had gone to considerable effort to make it clear that he didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to share space with anyone, had constructed his solitude so carefully over 8 years that he'd started to think it was a preference rather than a wound. The man who had looked at an old wagon coming through his gate and had wanted to refuse what was in it, and hadn't, for reasons he still couldn't entirely explain, except that the smell of bread had been part of it, and stubbornness had been part of it, and something else he hadn't named until much later. He folded the notice once, carefully, and put it in his coat pocket. "You keeping that?" Margaret said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him with the knowing expression of a woman who understood exactly what a folded piece of weathered paper represented to the man who had written it and chosen to keep it. She didn't say anything else. She began filling the order. He put the notice in the bottom drawer of the dresser when he got home, not with the photograph. The photograph was out now, back on the wall, not in the same place it had been, but in a different place, next to Lucy's drawing, next to the other drawing with everyone at the table. Clara looked out from the photograph with the expression she'd always had, the one that had cost him something every morning until he'd put it away, and then had cost him something different every morning after he put it away, which was the cost of absence rather than presence. He'd learned slowly that the two costs were not the same. Presence was harder, but it was also... This was the thing he was still understanding, still arriving at. It was also the only cost that built something. The notice went in the drawer because it also was a thing that had built something. It had sat on a post for 22 days, and then a woman had come with her children, and the life that had come through his gate in that old wagon was not the life he'd asked for, and was not the life he'd imagined, and was not the life he'd thought he wanted. It was better than all of those. It was the life that happened when you opened the gate. By summer, the ranch had doubled. Not all at once. Nothing on a working ranch happens all at once. And Caleb had spent enough years understanding the difference between an idea and the labor required to make an idea real. But the arrangement with Hutchins on the North Pasture had materialized into a genuine partnership, paper signed and Mara's hand in the accounting of it, and the additional 30 head were on the grass by June, and the grass was good that year, the snowmelt having gone into the ground rather than running off, which any rancher would tell you is the difference between a good year and a hard one. Evan ran most of the cattle operation by July. Not because Caleb stepped back from it, but because stepping back from it was what Caleb did in the particular areas where someone else had grown into the ability to carry it. He watched Evan work and thought about what it meant to build something on a piece of land. Not just build a fence or a barn or a herd, but build a practice, a knowledge, the kind of knowing that gets into a person's hands and body and becomes second nature. Evan had that. He'd had the raw material for it when he'd arrived, and the winter had refined it, and the spring and summer had expanded it, and what was standing now at the north fence line on a July morning, directing the movement of cattle with a confidence that came from genuine competence rather than performance, was a ranch hand of real quality who happened to also be 12, nearly 13 now, his birthday having arrived in June without ceremony, and with, from Caleb, a good pair of working gloves that Evan wore every day after. Lucy was at Danner's trading post on Wednesday afternoons, where Margaret had taken to letting her help organize the mail and read correspondence to the customers who needed it. She had proposed this arrangement herself to Margaret, in the direct manner she proposed all things, and Margaret had agreed in the same spirit she'd agreed to most things involving the Thorne household, which was that she'd learned to trust the quality of what came from it. Lucy walked the 3 miles each way without complaint, and came back full of information about what was happening in the valley, which she delivered at supper with the precision of a person who understands that accurate reporting requires distinguishing between what you observed and what you concluded. Owen turned 6 in March, as Evan had pointed out. He received the news of his birthday with the gravity appropriate to a major milestone, and then asked if it meant he could have his own horse, which it did not, but which planted a conversation that resolved itself by his 7th birthday into a pony of modest size and uncertain temperament that Owen named Captain and loved with his whole small heart. The valley held together in ways that had not been certain in February and were not guaranteed now but had become, through the winter's work, more possible than they'd been before. Hutchins brought no one any speeches about it. He showed up in April with his men for the fence work he'd promised. He participated in the summer meeting that Caleb had organized for the valley's ranchers, a practical affair, no ceremony, held in Caleb's barn over coffee. And he contributed to it with the particular authority of a man who had been through something and come out of it changed in ways he hadn't fully cataloged yet. He and Caleb would never be friends in the easy sense, but they were neighbors in the serious sense, which on the frontier was a different thing, and in many ways a more durable one. On an evening in late summer, with the light going gold over the western ridge, and the day's work done, and the supper things cleared, Caleb sat on the porch with Mara. They sat in the 2 chairs he'd put out in May, because there had been no chairs on the porch before, and it had seemed like something a porch needed if people were going to use it as a place to be rather than just a place to pass through. They sat with their coffee and watched the light change and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into the evening. The cattle in the far pasture, the horses, the particular cadence of Owen explaining something to the pony at the fence post, loud enough to carry, with the seriousness of a person instructing an animal that is not paying attention but is tolerating the instruction. "He's been out there an hour," Mara said. "Captain has strong opinions about listening," Caleb said. She smiled. It was not her polished or composed smile. It was the one she had when something struck her as genuinely funny, and she wasn't thinking about what she looked like. He'd come to understand over the winter and the spring that there were several different versions of Mara, and that the one sitting next to him on the porch in the evening, coffee in hand, not thinking about the accounts or the kitchen or the things that needed doing. This version was the one underneath all the others, the one that the others were built around. He liked all the versions. He liked this one most. "I was thinking," she said. "About what?" "About where we were last October." She looked at the yard, at the patched barn that was sound now, at the fence line running straight and solid to the tree line, at the bunkhouse with the curtains in the window and the rag rug inside that she'd beaten the dust out of back in November. "I came here because I needed somewhere to land," she said. "I told you that at the wedding. What I didn't say was that I didn't expect to actually land. I thought I'd rest for a season and move on." "What changed?" he said. She looked at him. "You opened the gate," she said. He understood what she meant. It was the same thing he'd been thinking about since May, since the notice came down from the post. The question of what actually happened when you made the small, practical decision to open a gate that you'd been planning to leave closed. The gate in October had been a literal thing, his hand on the latch, a moment of going against his own intention. But it was also the other gate, the one he'd kept shut for 8 years, the one that had required something he hadn't known he still had, which was the willingness to let something in before he knew what it was. He'd thought for a long time that that willingness was something the years had used up. The winter had shown him that it wasn't. It was just waiting for the right knock. That was the thing about loss, and he'd had enough of it to have arrived at this slowly and without anyone handing it to him. Loss didn't use up your capacity for things. It could make you think it had. You could build a life around the assumption that it had, construct a careful solitude that looked like preference, wake up every morning and eat bad food and make bad coffee, and tell yourself this was the shape of things now. But the capacity was still there. It just needed something real enough to ask for it. Mara was real. Her children were real. The winter had been real, and what it had asked of all of them had been real, and what had been built in the answering of it was real. He didn't say any of this. He wasn't a man who said things at full length when the point had already been made. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair. She turned her hand over and held his, the same practical grip she'd used in the kitchen at 3 a.m. when she'd rubbed the cold back into his fingers. And they sat there on the porch in the evening light and watched Owen negotiate with Captain and watched the gold go out of the western sky and the first stars begin tentatively to show themselves. From inside the house came Lucy's voice, then Evan's response, then the particular sound of the two of them disagreeing about something with the comfort of people who have disagreed so many times about so many things that the disagreement itself is a form of intimacy. The horses moved in the paddock. The creek, fully open now, ran steady over its stones. The notice was in the bottom drawer. The photograph was on the wall. The porch had chairs. There were people in his house, and cattle on his land, and a woman's hand in his. And the life he'd built around absence had been replaced, imperfectly and without ceremony, and one small decision at a time, by a life built around presence. He wasn't sure, even now, that he deserved it. He wasn't sure deserving was the right word for how you came to have the things that mattered. You didn't deserve them by virtue of having suffered or waited or been ready. You got them by opening the gate, even when you meant to leave it closed, by letting the thing through before you knew what it was, by being, in the right moment, just barely willing. That was enough. It turned out, it was always enough. The stars came out over Black Ridge, and the ranch sat quiet and full in the summer dark, and the man who had once nailed a notice to a post asking for silence found that he had no use for it anymore.